We now have time for Q&A. So if you have a question for all the presenters or for one of the presenters, you can post it in the Q&A. There's a little button on the down on your screen where you can post your questions. We have about 15 minutes for that, and then Stephan has the challenge to wrap this up. Don't be shy. I see there's still a lot of people that have stuck with us through all the presentations, and I'm sure that many people will have questions for our presenters. Okay, so the first question is from Liam McClelland, and Liam wants to write a paper for his master's on the tribe of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, and he wants to link this to sexual violence and rape. And his question is, where would you suggest to look for historic cases of rape as a tool of war? I don't know who wants to answer that. Philip, is that a question for you? Or Brandon?
I can start, although I think this might actually be a perfect question for you, Heleen, because I think you are definitely much more of an expert on that. And so, I don't know to what extent you would consider that sort of historical, but I mean, just the other day I've read, and you shared that with me, Heleen, so you should actually really, answer that question. But I've read this interesting paper about sexual violence against men and boys and its strategic employment in elements during the Second World War as part of the Holocaust. So I think that's certainly a more historical case to sort of look for. Beyond that, to be honest with you, I have no idea what cases to look into. Heleen?
Well, yeah, there's many cases. I think any war has sexual violence cases. So you just need to dig and look at cases. I'm assuming that you are also talking about women as victims. So I think it's ubiquitous in any war. You should find examples of sexual violence. And I see Tanya nodding, so she's agreeing with me. So I think the Vietnam War comes to mind, the Holocaust, the Yugoslav wars. I think any war. And we have another question, a question for Philip from an anonymous attendee. Brilliant work. I'm incredibly interested in your rejection of the term feminization and homosexualization. And I'd be interested to hear your take on the complex relationship between sexual violence against men and the mainstream institutional feminism and the critique of gender neutrality, for example, in the ICC.
Yeah, thank you for sort of that comment and that question. I mean, I didn't go much into detail into the sort of rejection of that sort of language and the conceptualization there, although I probably could, but maybe I shouldn't now because this will be never ending. But I think as I alluded to sort of the discomfort there, sort of, the normative sort of ideas around what if we use language like feminization and equate that with victimization and vulnerability, I think there's very sort of misogynistic sort of tendencies or assumptions behind that, which I think by just sort of avoiding that, maybe or finding a different way, we can't resolve, but we can sort of at least circumvent that. Now, looking at the question here now, my take on the complex relationship between sexual violence against men and sort of mainstream feminism and critique of gender neutrality. I don't know if I have a take on that, to be honest with you. I mean, it is sort of, talking about this, raising awareness about that, and I kind of alluded to that in the introduction a little bit, I think, to my talk, is kind of challenging, and there are, very thorny sort of debates, I think, and, criticisms of highlighting this type of violence, in an international arena and institutional arena, that this would sort of, divert attention from, for instance, sexual violence against women, which is sort of more, on the mainstream sort of feminist agenda, which goes into that, critique of gender neutrality, for instance, at the ICC. Yeah, I don't know if I actually have a strong take on that, but I think, and we wrote about that in a paper that Heleen and myself and other colleagues published, I think 2 weeks ago, that what I think is needed is sort of to move beyond these, fights over resources and over attention when it comes to what experiences of gender are attended to in any sort of public space or institutional space, and to sort of push for a more, collaborative approach, I think, that sort of does pay attention to, any of these experiences, including queer experiences, including violence against, non-conforming identities. But I don't know if that's sort of exactly what you're looking for here, but I guess that's part of my take on some of these relationships.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I wanted to add on the homosexualization, feminization issue that there's an interesting work by Rogers Brubaker on a different topic, but he talks about terms of practice and terms of analysis, and you shouldn't confuse the two. And I think there's some truth in there about this, whether as a researcher you should use these terms and kind of embed yourself in that same context. There's a question for Tanya now. Would it make sense terminologically to talk about something like comradeship rather than friendship, given the specifics of these relationships in a corporate organizational context? Or would you characterize this as a process, like from comradeship to friendship?
Thank you for this question, Armin. I think it's really good. And what argument I'm trying to make in this book is that these friendships, and I would still call them friendships because they are nevertheless very intimate and personally important and effective in ways that do not necessarily involve ideas of comradeship that were institutionally promoted. But on the other hand, these kind of affective ties were not kind of, unintended consequence of what Yugoslav army as a socialist institution was doing. There was kind of, how to call it, there was an accord between what these men believed and how they approached their situation with serving in the army, with what the army as a socialist institution, as a state institution, actually wanted to promote. So definitely comradeship was central, and it's central generally for national militaries, I would say, everywhere. But these friendships basically emerged out of that concept and became, of course, much more resistant and took their own life that continued through certain forms, also when the country that promoted that comradeship so heavily ceased to exist, and when this comradeship actually turned into its opposite in the conflicts in the 90s. So I would keep the difference, but I would insist on the fact that these affective ties were not outside of the institutional working of the Yugoslav military, but was basically part of the same ideological network in which both citizens and institutions participated.
Well, next up we have, I'll take two questions together that are both for Brandon. Victoria has a question about boys and men who label others as snowflakes. I found it very difficult to argue with those guys because I perceive them as very very stubborn and a bit arrogant. Do you, Mr. Hamber, have advice of how to talk to those guys and help them? And the other question is sort of similar. From Simon. He is asking, Brandon mentions alternatives for toxic masculinity, and what would these be? Can you give examples?
Okay, thanks. Those are good questions. I don't know if I can completely answer them. I think in terms of the snowflake question, what I was trying to say in the paper is I'm actually probably more interested in the structures and processes that give birth to such ideas. And it's one of those sort of fascinating concepts that seems to have really found root and found home. And that's really what I would be primarily interested in. And in relation to a concept like that, for me, the question is this something new or is this different? So, you know, we've seen insults of this sort of masculine nature throughout history. You know, the pinning of feathers on men during the war by suffragettes as a way of highlighting their cowardice is a similar type of example, but in a completely different frame, but is equally a gendered type of an idea. So, I mean, I'm interested in what gives birth to these ideas, and I haven't thought about it too much, but as I saw your question, I was sort of thinking, you know, what's interesting with that type of an insult is actually it's being hurled at the people who are arguably the smartest, the healthiest, and are probably going to live the longest in human generations ever at our current process. So it's actually an insult which is sort of also being attached to power in some shape or form, even though it doesn't look like it is, and made me sort of think a bit like, you know, if you in parts of South Africa, there are still women who are killed as witches, and often the women who are killed as witches are those who are incredibly quite powerful, have a sort of hold on their community in some shape or form. So I would be interested more in those dynamics than necessarily saying this is what you need to say to somebody. Having said that, if I was thinking about it and sort of said, well, what could be done? I actually think with those type of issues, and I see it with my own son, where, you know, these type of insults are also thrown in his direction at different moments in time, is that actually it's sort of like a whole system approach. So, you know, the school as a whole would need to be engaging with these type of issues around femininity and masculinity. I don't think it's a sort of anti-bullying message. I don't think it's like putting boys in a room and girls in a room. There's something about sort of like a whole school type approach that would be needed. Presumably you were talking about schools. I'm not too sure. So I don't know, maybe it's a bit of a long rambling answer, but there's a lot in it. You know, in terms of examples of alternative masculinities, I mean, I think, again, I'm sort of going to resist the answer to sort of answer that, because what I was trying to say in the paper is there's a temptation for us to create these normative ideas as to what actually is the alternative, and that is still dominated by a really Western individualistic discourse, that the alternative is, you know, the metrosexual man is sort of the alternative. And so I'm actually going to resist answering that question and sort of say, I don't really know what the alternative is, but I don't think it's that sort of individualized, you know, man who's found himself Western notion of what it has to be. I think alternative could be a whole range of different things. And for example, knowing Philip's work, I think some of the victims and survivors he works with actually produce an alternative form of masculinity, but it's not in any of those frames that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. Let's go to Uher then. A question from Sana Weber. She's asking, like, perpetrators of violence do not often admit that they've committed sexual violence, and your quotes are also from survivors of violence. Did you come across any admissions of sexual violence by perpetrators? And if so, how did they justify this?
Thank you. Very good question. Also ties in with the question by Bert Ingelade, which is roughly a similar question. I think that, I mean, overall, I have not come across any of my perpetrators actually speaking that openly about their own acts. Hence, I said conspiracy of silence, because obviously the survivors find it very difficult to speak out, and the perpetrators also hold their silence. But what you do get is you get two different things. One is you get passive voice. So they would say things like, women were assaulted. But things have happened that should not have happened. So they have a passive voice and euphemism. And on the other hand, you have something which is draws more from the kind of the language and the kind of thick cultural context of Syrian culture. They would say things such as, which one of the perpetrators said, he said, "We trampled on their honor. So that is, very clear, unmistakable language in Syria for because their honor, because he's talking about the men. We trampled on the honor of the men. That means that we had that we committed sexual violence against their women, right? Because the women are the property of the men. Or they would say something as, pardon the language, we fucked his mother, or we fucked his sister, which doesn't necessarily mean the actual sexual violence against these people. It can also mean like we really ruined his life, for example. We really destroyed him. But because ordinary curse words in Syrian or in Arabic are also highly gendered, there's no way of really telling. And it's in that type of that ambivalence, the ambiguity actually where much of this discourse is located. Would it be okay if I also answered the other question by Annemarie Heleen, because it's about paramilitarism?
Yeah, but I wanted to keep it all also for the others if they want to answer. But I mean, I'm assuming that everyone's read it by now, but you can go first, Touquet.
Yeah, there are a number of examples. This is a very good question, actually. For example, in the Armenian Genocide, you get that when most of the men are killed and the women, many of them survivors of sexual violence, they pour into Lebanon in the 1920s and 30s. And the genocide actually leads to a matriarchal restructuring of our Armenian community. The same thing we can say about ISIS sexual violence against Yazidi women, because of global attention that women like Nadia Murad and others have received, as well as the fact that the Yazidi religious leaders, the sheikhs, cleared the children born from these rapes as part of the Yazidi community, rather than as Muslim bastards. The combination of these two forces actually led to these women's empowerment. Paradoxically, and for example, the entrance of women into the workforce, which before was unheard of.
I don't know, Tanya, how would you compare that to the Yugoslav conflict, or?
Yeah, I have to say that when I was looking at these pumped up men of Syria, it's so resembling to this culture of Yugoslav. That was actually started being shaped during the Yugoslav conflicts, but it's still there and it's very present, and it's not so bound to ethnic violence anymore. It is simply a structuring society factor, and there is a layer of society where it still works. So for me, I think it's difficult to say what really whether some positive.
Well, I think if you think about the Srebrenica genocide, that there's also been some process of empowerment, you could say, of the female survivors in a way, which is kind of similar to what Uher was saying.
Definitely, yeah, in that sense, definitely.
But on the whole,
yes,
it's not a matriarchal society.
Yeah.
I think that we have answered all of your questions, and there's still quite a few people there. There's someone is saying something in the chat as well. Philip, you might want to attend to that. It's for you. But I want to invite Stephan to wrap up this session.
Thanks a lot, Heleen, dear colleagues, and dear participants. So how much time would I have? Because for the moment, formally speaking, there are 5 minutes left.
Well, yes.
Yeah, okay. Good. Well, thanks so much for the invitation, and most of all for the organization of this seminar. We know the history. It has been condensed, but very dense at the same time. And I really appreciate the very rich presentations that we have had. Of course, my very quick wrap up can only be very quick and therefore be very selective. So I'm going to try to pick up on 1 or 2 points maximum per presentation, and then give some general ideas, and that in 5 minutes. That is a challenge indeed. First of all, Heleen, you yourself started by talking about 2 areas, let's say, in which gendered issues are coming up, and particularly sexual violence then. That is to say, the politics of gender in its totality as an umbrella. Let's say you refer to the US, for example, and then the more violent conflict situations where gender-based violence, of course, has been committed. And at the end, we talked mostly about the second part. But on the other hand, the terminology that Brandon used, namely the wars, is very much a terminology that could encompass larger issues and larger sections, also in non-violence or non-violent conflicts, because politics are often non-violent conflicts. And sometimes they lead to violence, obviously. So it's an extension, a continuation, one could say, a bit like Clausewitz was sometimes saying, you know, war is the extension of politics with different means. Here, of course, you could also see it in the reverse way, that war is the, politics is the extension of war in other ways. So Brandon, actually with the idea of social imaginary, very much triggered my thoughts on this classic in sociology, of course, Charles Wright Mills, talking about the sociological imagination. And I think that's a really powerful concept, a very strong one that in his view encompasses, you know, the element of history. How did societies evolve in such a way? Then biography, one could say the micro level. How do individuals operate at a societal level, but in their own individual context and daily context, and then the social structure element, of course. And it seems to me that if we look at those three elements together, historical, micro, and meso, then we can combine lots of things, which may also lead us actually to try to think of change. Because that's also one of the elements that came up very strongly through the questioning, how to change this. I mean, to understand something is one, but to try to change and modify is something else. So this is one element I wanted to flag. In Tanya's piece, I was struck by this idea of total institutions, as you mentioned. Again, a classical sociological author here comes up, Irving Goffman, obviously, who talked about prisons and army and what have you. And I was interested in actually trying to understand how is it that people in such institution where they're literally very close together, where they have bonding of sometimes lifetime bonding, that at the end they may get separated, not only physically, but actually emotionally and socially, because that is what happened with former comrades, let's say, of the Yugoslav army, then becoming opponents because they belong to a Serbian army, Croatian army, and other types of armed forces. So where is the tipping point that could help us explain how the divisions are being created? It seems to me, again, that politics can be a very strong tipping point, or at least generate a strong tipping point, and ideology in general. You talked about ethnicity, and of course, as we know, in the Yugoslav context, we also talk often about religion, and maybe the intersection of both. And so religion is actually something I did not hear too much talked about today, and I would be interested in trying to find out what role religion plays, not only in fueling conflict in general, but also in fueling or maybe generating or facilitating specific stereotypes about gender, and therefore about femininities and masculinities. In Ugur's presentation, I found it very interesting. Again, you talked about bonding and the fact that some of these tough guys, let's say, are very close together through the violence that they are committing. It's not only because they are part of a militia or part of a group, it's also because they perform certain common activities which are transgressing, and therefore they create a special kind of bond. A little bit, it reminded me of child soldiers who have to ritually kill or maim or torture or inflict violence on their community members, even their family members, and that creates a bond for them then to go back to the militia. So I was wondering how that process, I would call it, of humiliation is then taking place. Is it conscious? Is it unconscious? In genocide studies, there's of course a lot of talk about dehumanization. And again, the idea of a tipping point. As soon as you start thinking of another person, not as a person anymore, but as a thing, as an object or of inferior capacities and inferior qualities, then of course you strip a person from its or his or her humanity. And then of course everything is possible, because you're not on equal footing anymore. but try to create hierarchies. So where is that tipping point in particular conflicts that actually lead us or lead certain people to do so? And Brexit may be another example, although of course in very different ways, of almost demonizing the other party. And then finally, in Philip's presentation, I was struck by the fact that he, of course, stressed the fact that there is very little information about this topic because it's a very taboo topic. So where does the taboo come from? We found similar conclusions in our research on sexual violence in Bosnia, for example, through a survey which we conducted 15 years ago. And there it was completely underreported, at least in relation to the official figures that you sometimes see in other reports. So where is the taboo coming from? Is it religious? Is it identitarian? Is it something else? I'd be really interested in trying to find out. And you also briefly hinted at the role of law, because talking about the resolution on women, peace and security and that agenda and the necessity to bring it to the forefront. So let me conclude with that by actually talking during half a minute about law. Where is law in all of this? There's so many norms, there's so many standards in humanitarian law, in human rights law, in criminal law, in general international law, in domestic law, in tort law, that completely prohibit such kind of behavior. So why is it so persistent? And I think it has to do with that tension that is often there, not only here when it comes to sexual violence or masculinities and femininities, but in general, namely that culture and law are often not congruent. William Ogburn, the American sociologist, talks about the cultural lag, whereby in culture, things can happen, can move forward, and law is not following or not following quickly enough. But on the other hand, law can provide a sort of framework within which discussions can be held, because it raises things to the forefront, to a level of legislatures, of judiciary, in the public domain and the public debate. So I'm intrigued by that relationship between law and culture, law and society, let's say, and maybe there is a way to actually raise the level of law to such a degree that it also provides more space for discussion, for debate, hopefully a non-violent debate, because that, of course, is not the idea to fall into another trap of continuing violence, but rather to stop it. So the cultures and the norms and values that are grounded and grounding in cultures seem essential to me as well. I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And I really learned a lot. Very fascinating talks. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those reflections, Stephan. And that leaves me to wrap up today's session. I think there's lots more things that we could talk about. I mean, this is just the beginning, I hope, of a continuing conversation. And yeah, I would love to go for a drink with all of you, actually, and to have, it would be ideal if we could just now have a little reception, talk to each other, and chat, but well, we'll have to postpone that for a couple of more months, I'm afraid. So thank you all, also to the audience, for attending in such large numbers and for yeah, keeping at it until the end. Thanks a lot, and see you for the next one.
Yeah.